Hello, hello! Today we're going to be talking about another sequence type that goes down. This one, descending thirds, which sounds a little something like this. Let's first remind ourselves what a descending third harmonic motion looks like in tonal Western art music style. Take this G major example in a simple quadruple meter. Roman numeral and contextual analysis shows that we have tonic expanded via a submediant chord, a tonic substitute, moving toward a 4 chord, which initiates our predominant area, which is then expanded through an intensification of the predominant in a 2 chord, and then moving 5-1, sort of IAC closure material. So, and with scale degree 3 on top. So if we look back, we have 3 instances of a falling third progression. And then after that, it looks like falling fifths, 2, 5, 1, something that we saw with descending fifth sequences before. So then what we can see with this descending third pattern is a lot of common chord tones, a lot of common tones between chords. And essentially this is due to the fact that we're talking about tertian harmonies. Tertian harmonies are built on thirds. So if we're looking at 2 chords whose roots are a third apart from one another, there's going to be a lot of similarity. There's going to be at least 66% of the same genetic material held intact or invariant, unchanged, moving from one chord toward the other. So we see that this third progression is a pretty common sort of motion that we're going to explore what happens when it's utilized in something like a sequence. Let's unpack how this concept works with a descending third sequence. Key signature are 3 sharps, and the E natural at the end of this system tells me A major is the key we're looking at. We have first species counterpoint between the 2 voices, and intervals analyzed between. So we have a 1 measure model that is then copy and pasted as a sequential leg, which is then copy and pasted as a sequential leg again. And each iteration of it, the model to the first sequential leg is going down by a third. And then that sequential leg to the start of the next sequential leg, that compound third, that 10th, is being transposed downward by a third yet again. So these intervals that are moving back and forth create a pattern, what we refer to as a linear intervallic pattern, or LIP. So we have a 10-5 linear intervallic pattern holding this sequence together. And those intervals tell us a lot about what chords are happening. A 10th above any given bass note, I would understand it to maybe be a root position chord. Same for a 5th above a bass note. So then we might end up with this series of harmonies kind of holding this together, moving toward what looks like a pretty normative half cadence. And just like we saw with descending fifth sequences, we have non-functionality with this sequence. This sequence connects point A to, well, point A. It connects tonic to tonic, all as tonic expansion before moving toward that dominant chord. So this is what we're talking about with the non-functionality of this whole entire sequence type anyways. If we take a closer look at something like the root motion that's going on, we see something a little different than we saw with descending fifths. Here we have a chord progression in which we have first a descending fourth and then an ascending step. Then a descending fourth, then an ascending step, and then so on. And this is essentially how we get our sort of terminology that we borrow from Stephen Lates again to be able to make sense of how this sequence is working harmonically. The interval of transposition is a third down. The model is transposed down a third to be sequenced, which is then transposed down again another third to create the next sequential copy. And then within the parentheses, we see a patterning that's going on. A tonic chord moving toward a 5 chord, going down a 4th, and then a 5 chord stepping up to 6, -4 +2. 6 going down a fourth to a 3 chord, and then stepping up to a 4 chord, -4 plus 2 again. This is how we get our terminology to understand the harmonic motion that's going on, because if we go down a fourth and up a step, that's the same thing as going down a third. That's how the model and sequential legs are interacting with one another. And this is all a way of saying this is how we get to descending thirds, or what a lot of textbooks talk about as the Pachelbel's canon sequence, so on and so on. It's a series of going down a fourth, up a step, where the model and legs are being transposed down a third diatonically. So if we want to see how these things look in terms of a 4-part harmony, all we gotta do is write out the inner voices. And we end up with something like this that'll help flesh out some more of the chord tones. Notice here that we see something consistent with what we saw with descending fifth sequences. Because the pattern is the most important thing and the overall sequence is non-functional, we see things like leading tones misbehaving. Measure 1, beat 3. G sharp doesn't resolve back to A natural. It gets pushed down to F sharp, and so on and so on. Same with G sharp in measure 2, beat 3. Although that's with a 3 chord, we might not expect the same resolution, but the same thing happens, getting pushed down into the next sort of chord, because the pattern is what takes over as the most important thing at this point. So we do have unresolved leading tones, but these things shouldn't concern us when we're talking about sequential patterning in general. When descending thirds is placed in a minor mode, it essentially functions the same way, but a few slight nuances to keep in mind. The way that it's the same is the harmonies can be exactly the same. In this case, A minor instead of A major, starting on the same chord, a tonic chord, and getting to the same place, a 5 chord. So Roman numeral, in terms of function, nothing is really different. Chord qualities are different, but nothing else. We still have the same non-functional area. We know that 4 chords going to tonic chords are non-functional, so we can make a stronger claim about where to put parentheses in this context. And we still have the same LIP, 10-5, 10-5, so on and so on. But what is different is that in minor mode, we have to reconcile with leading tone function, because we know that a leading tone gives us something like functionality, indicated by the contextual analysis here. When we get to that dominant chord, we know that we are in functional land at that point. G sharp gives us function. But elsewhere, we have things like G natural, which in major mode was a leading tone, not resolving appropriately. Here it just looks like a passing motion, subtonic note, but we get a lot of it. So that modal sort of flavor comes out a little bit more in minor mode, mainly because of those sorts of those modal scale degrees that are being articulated. So here's what it sounds like in minor. So at the very end, we get a sense of true function and dominant. Now you might be asking, well, is there any way to smooth out this bass line? With descending fifths, we created a sort of interlocking third motion, which isn't the only way you can do it in that case. But is there one way we can maybe make this bass line a little bit smoother? Well, we can do it with chordal inversions. So let's go back to major mode for a second. So now we're back in A major, and you can see that the melody is still the same. But I replaced that jagged disjunct bass line with just straight descending motion, conjunct, parallel tense with the melody. Not exactly an example of great first species counterpoint, if I must say so myself. But that being said, there is still a pattern to be recognized here. It's a little bit harder to see than maybe when there's a jagged bass line. No doubt that that's easier to see on the page, but I think we can still hear it with the right kind of ears. And the reason being for that is essentially that we are able to hear sequences usually much faster than we can see them on the page. We can see them sometimes. Sometimes it's really clear, but other times it's not. So this is where listening strategy becomes really important. So you might notice that this LIP kind of obfuscates the sequential motion, which is totally normative. This is something that happens a lot. This sequence, the way it's articulated here with a descending third motion, with a parallel third motion, is what Robert Yurdigan talks about as a Romanesque schema. He calls it a schema because it's so consistent in the galant style of music. We're talking about the 17th and 18th century music styles of Europe. It's so common as an introductory function that we can give it a name. And essentially, it's a way that composers could get a descending line to basically pass through the leading tone going down. So this schema is found very frequently as an initiation gesture, and it's also frequently found in major mode. So we do have that 10-10 LIP that's kind of fastening everything together. And you can imagine this being a great opportunity for a series of 4/3 suspensions. It just lends itself nicely to something like a 4/3 suspension then being generated. So if we look at it, we can still make sense of Roman numerals here. We can give it the same exact, or we can assign it the same Roman numerals that we did before. 1 moving to 5, moving to 6, so on and so on, following our same patterning. But you might notice the bass voice does not adhere to this sort of motion. It is not going down a fourth, up a step. But harmonically, we are doing that sort of thing between each chord in the model, generating the LIP, and then the same thing always happens again, but it's transposed down a third in this case, and then it initiates it again a second time afterward. So essentially, I'm trying to get us to think about harmony versus bass motion, which is the same thing we've come across in identifying chord qualities, root versus bass note. So then if we put it into 4 voices, we can start to get a sense about how these, or what these chords really are, with the LIP still intact, even though the figures below are representing chordal inversions now. And you might notice something that's curious about inner voices here. Notice what the alto voice is doing. It's all over the place. And notice what the tenor voice is doing in conjunction with it. The tenor voice is also doing a little bit of leaping, going down a third. So when you have the outer voices being completely conjunct like this, one of the inner voices is going to take over the complicated role that I call Skippy voice. And I got that terminology from FSU professor Michael Buckler. You should look up his articles, fascinating stuff. Anyways, Skippy voice is a very helpful sort of thing. You might notice that this alto line kind of looks like the bass line in previous examples. Sorry. You might notice that essentially that bass voice has moved into another voice. So this is something that's really common with sequences as well. So these prototypical shapes I'm showing you, you can rearrange them, get different LIPs, different varieties, and still end up with essentially the same thing, which just demonstrates the versatility of these sequence types. Because you could imagine something like this Romanesque schema being something like maybe an antecedent in a parallel period, and then doing the same sort of thing again, and making something like a parallel period. It's really easy to see how this initiating function could work as almost a mini sentence: basic idea, lead to cadence, and so on. So then, if we see that same thing cast into minor mode, same exact stuff as before, we still have Skippy voice happening in the same exact areas, the alto voice and the tenor voice. But I put this example in minor mode once more just to remind us of the fact that because this sequence emphasizes scale degrees 3, 6, and 7 so quickly and then reaffirms them, again, those are modal scale degrees. Scale degrees 3, 6, and 7. Those are the ones we manipulate in minor mode. because those are the ones that are emphasized, or those are the scale degrees that get emphasized here pretty much on the surface, we end up with something that sounds pretty modal in general. And that G sharp, once it comes into play, we're back in minor mode. We're back where we might have been before. So now I'm going to show you one other LIP that's super duper common with this progression. And it's what we call a 10-6 LIP. So we're still going to see the same exact thing we've seen a few times now. A one measure model, one measure sequential leg, and then it's repetition. By the way, these things won't always be one measure, luckily, in real music, but for the purposes of demonstration, that's what we're sticking with here. So a 10-6 LIP gives us quite the disjunct melodic line here. In a sense, we end up with this. Down a third, descending a third, and then moving toward what looks like a half cadence here. So the same chords are possible here, and that's sixth actually on every other chord. Tells us a lot about the chords. So we're starting to see some consistency there. And we get a little bit of a different sound with this jagged contour in the melody, but it's super common. So we can see the chord progression is still doing the same exact things we saw before, same exact harmonies. We don't expect too much variance there if we started on tonic anyways and initiate with that sequence type, but that's what we get. And you can imagine that if we had an outer voice schema like that. So sequences in general, just a reminder to us, are a series of non-functional harmonies, and they contain an LIP, one interval per chord that defines it as a linear intervallic pattern. While descending fifth, we saw every harmony going down by a fifth, the overall pattern going down a step each time. With descending thirds, each pattern ends up moving down by a third. And to get there, we go down a fourth, then up a step in various ways.